joining us, and everyone in person, thank you. So I'm not going to be up here for more than a minute, but I just want to first thank everybody for being here. My name is Justin Reish. I'm the Executive Director of the International Church Society, which you see right here, but I'm also the director of the center that you're in here, which is called the National Churchill Leadership Center. So this topic tonight is interesting in the sense there's no sound. Okay, listen. I'm glad everyone in here can hear us. But best laid plans when it comes to technology, of course. We'll figure it out as we usually do. Let me say that the man who is sitting here, Lee Pollock, is my predecessor as executive director from the International Churchill Society. And he led the society, which was then known as the Churchill Center, from about 2010 to 2016. And he helped fundraise and build the space that you're in. So you'll be hearing from the original person, if we can call him that. But also, about 11 years ago, I graduated college and I moved to Chicago, and I needed a job. And I had studied British history, and I was looking on job sites, and I saw the Churchill Center. I said, oh, it's pretty interesting. Salary wasn't great, but that's okay. I was still pretty young. And a man named Lee Pollock hired me. So I have known Lee for over 11 years. He's been to my wedding. He's a great mentor and friend. And, that him deciding to hire me, and do not mind my wonderful assistant, Alice, who's up here making sure everything works. But the man who hired me, that hire changed my life. So if you all join me in welcoming Lee Pollock, the man who changed my life, but also, of course, our speaker today, to the podium.
It's not advancing. That's the next problem.
Oh my God, what is going on here?
Okay, there we go. All right.
So just click that.
So not this. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Harry F. Boyd Sr.
We're back to Richmond, Virginia, October 1929, with the legendary Governor Harry Byrd. So the occasion was a dinner at the governor's mansion for a distinguished British visitor who had just come to stay with the Byrd family. The governor's 14-year-old son, Harry Byrd Jr., was standing at the bottom of the mansion's grand staircase when their guest, raced down to meet him. Apparently mistaking the young Byrd for the butler, the guest said to him sharply, "Young man, fetch me a newspaper." Somewhat startled, Byrd complied, walked a block to the Hotel Richmond, and picked up a copy of that day's Richmond News Leader newspaper to bring back to their guest. He later said he was rewarded with a 25-cent tip, which he kept for the rest of his life. The British visitor was, of course, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, and he was a demanding house guest. As young Byrd recalled, Churchill took to specifying the exact time of day he wanted each meal and what he expected on the menu. And apparently, he had the habit of wandering around the mansion's second floor in his underwear. When it was finally time to leave the next morning, the Byrds stood outside their front door, waving goodbye to their distinguished guests. Byrd later recalled, quote, "I remember my mother's first words to my father as Churchill's car pulled out of the driveway. 'Harry,' she said, 'don't ever invite that man back.'" So what was Winston Churchill, already one of the most famous men in Britain and the world, doing in Virginia? He had lost the position of Chancellor of the Exchequer in the British elections of May 1929, when his Conservative Party was defeated, but he was certainly busy. A visit to what was then a relatively quiet southern state was not something to be expected. Trying to find this image of Churchill as Chancellor, which is not coming up. There we go. Churchill, in fact, was on the last stage of a 3-month tour coast to coast of America. He had come because he recognized the power of the United States, even in a time of isolationism, and its importance to the future of the world. He delivered a raft of paid lectures across the country. In addition to wanting to share his views on world issues, he badly needed the money, and Americans would pay handsomely to hear him. So what did Winston Churchill's fascination with the Civil War mean? How did it come about, and what did he say about it? Churchill was born into one of Britain's greatest families, the grandson of the 7th Duke of Marlborough. That ancestor had famously defeated the forces of King Louis XIV of France at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. 1874, the year of Churchill's birth, was only 9 years after the end of the Civil War, which was a fresh and vivid memory for Churchill's father, Lord Randolph, as it was for everyone in Britain. The spectacle of this great English-speaking republic, less than a century old, but now tearing itself apart, was followed with consuming interest. Sentiment about the war in Britain was divided. While slavery had been abolished in the British Empire in 1833, support for the South was widespread. At various points, friction between Britain and the Union threatened to lead to direct involvement in the conflict on the Southern side. That, of course, never happened, but what a game changer it would have been. It was natural that Winston Churchill would gravitate to the history of the United States, as his mother was the Brooklyn-born Jenny Jerome, the daughter of a wealthy New York financier, Leonard Jerome. Leonard was a vehement supporter of the Union. He was also a part owner of the New York Times newspaper, and during that city's vicious draft riots in 1863, personally helped to fight off a mob that was attempting to torch the Times' office. The Times had been targeted because it was well known to be a supporter of the Republican Party. I understand that's not as much the case today. Churchill grew up with cartoons in the satirical magazine Punch about the Civil War. At age 12, he wrote to his mother, quote, "My birthday is drawing near. I should rather like a copy of General Grant's History of the American Civil War." The Civil War was the subject of his entrance examination when he applied to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst 3 years later. As he learned more about it, he said, quote, "It was the most interesting of all the wars of which I have read." After graduating from Sandhurst in 1895, Churchill made his first visit to America. There he told his New York host about a fascinating new book that had become popular in Britain, but as yet was little read in the United States. It was Stephen Crane's classic, The Red Badge of Courage. Churchill was a fast-rising star in the House of Commons after his first election to Parliament in 1900 and entered the cabinet just a few years later. As military rivalries between Germany, France, and Britain intensified, Churchill looked to the Civil War for lessons. He thought that Britain should cultivate a volunteer army, as had the North and South, and that the Civil War would provide examples of innovative military technology that could inspire Britain. Churchill ended up being a proponent of two game-changing innovations of 20th century warfare, the tank and the airplane. And when the First World War came, Churchill recognized in the trench warfare of the Western Front and the Allied blockade of Germany echoes of the Civil War. He understood that while the Allies, like the North, would emerge victorious, the price of that victory would be written in unprecedented carnage and casualties. Early on that 1929 visit to America, Churchill received an invitation to participate in celebrating the anniversary of the surrender in Yorktown, Virginia, of General Cornwallis to George Washington. Not approving of the outcome, Churchill thought it was his patriotic duty to decline. But while in Virginia, he very much wanted to see the Civil War battlefields. He could not have had a better guide than this man, Douglas Southall Freeman, the editor of the Richmond News Leader, the son of a still living Confederate officer, and a historian then writing what would become a classic 4-volume biography of Robert E. Lee. When that Pulitzer Prize-winning study was finally published in the 1930s, Freeman acknowledged his debt to Churchill, saying, quote, "Mr. Churchill went over the ground with this writer and made many helpful observations." The two men walked the battlefields of Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Spotsylvania, and the 7 Days. After returning to London, Churchill recorded his impressions in an article in the Daily Telegraph in December 1929 entitled "Old Battlefields of Virginia." Churchill began his account by striking a contrast between North and South. He wrote, "It takes only a few hours to go from Washington to Richmond, but we breathe a different air. It is another country. We have exchanged the 20th century for the 19th and crossed the mysterious boundary which separates the present from the past." He continued, "We have entered the domain of history." Churchill went on to paint the scene vividly. He wrote, "We march with Lee and Jackson, with Stuart, Longstreet, and Early, through autumn woodlands, lonely in their leafy splendors of gold and fading crimson. It is still a broken land." He described the various battlefields and noted, quote, "No one can understand what happened by merely reading books. You must see the ground. You must cover the distances in person. You must measure the rivers and see what the swamps were really like." And he could still see the war's impact in front of his eyes. He wrote, "The farmhouses and churches still show the scars of shot and shell. The woods are full of trenches and rifle pits. The larger trees are full of bullets." And then he added, "Before the Confederate Museum in Richmond, there flies the rebel flag." Churchill described the area south of the Rappahannock River as, quote, "one on which perhaps more soldiers have perished in an equal space than anywhere except Ypres and Verdun." Shortly after his return to England, Churchill wrote a magazine article which he contributed to a book entitled "If It Had Happened Otherwise." Among the chapters in this exercise in counterfactual history was one entitled "If Booth Had Missed Lincoln." Churchill's choice was a double negative: if Lee had not won the Battle of Gettysburg. At his imaginary Gettysburg, Churchill conjures up Jeb Stuart and his cavalry arriving at the Union rear with powerful effect, just as George Pickett begins his famous charge. A mass panic disrupts the Union forces, and the charge is successful. Churchill himself had served as a cavalry officer, so it's not surprising that he made Jeb Stuart one of the heroes. As Churchill tells the story, the Confederates are victorious, and Lee turns south, capturing Washington 3 days later. The war is over. And then, in Churchill's fertile imagination, Lee, in a, quote, master stroke, declares the end of slavery, which swings British opinion towards an alliance with the Confederacy. Facing this now formidable combination, and with the issue of slavery gone, Abraham Lincoln in September signs what Churchill called the Peace of Harper's Ferry, giving slaves their freedom, but establishing the South as an independent nation. But Churchill's not finished with his story. Facing the rise of Germany in the early 20th century, President Theodore Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Arthur Balfour meet to consider an alliance. And when the president of the Confederate States, a Virginian named Woodrow Wilson, joins them, the three nations sign the Covenant of the English-Speaking Association, which adopts international peace and disarmament as its foreign policy. And then in 1914, when continental Europe begins to mobilize, the English speakers threaten war and the belligerents stand down. Thus, in Churchill's words, World War I, which, quote, might well have led to the loss of many millions of lives, never came to pass, all because Jeb Stuart arrived in the nick of time and Robert E. Lee did win the Battle of Gettysburg. Alas for the world, it all never happened. In 1932, Churchill signed a contract to write a major work of popular history, which would become 4 volumes entitled A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. Wanting to appeal to the large American audience, Churchill knew that the story of the United States, and in particular the Civil War, should be a significant part of the work. Over the next few years, he wrote much of the 4 volumes, but had to set them aside in September 1939, when he became, to say the least, very busy. The History of the English-Speaking Peoples was finally published between 1956 and 1958, and immediately became an international bestseller. It was criticized by some people for paying little attention to social or economic history, but it is a beautifully written, fluid, and expressive narrative. It is perhaps the most read and most beloved of all of Churchill's works. In its review, the New York Times noted Churchill, quote, has the visual imagination to actually see the events he describes. More importantly, the work skillfully presents the case for the historic special relationship of the 2 great English-speaking nations, Britain and America. This was a phrase that Churchill had coined at his famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. For Churchill, that special relationship was not just military or political, but was grounded in shared values and was a bulwark of democracy for the world. It's not surprising that these 4 volumes have gone through multiple editions and are still in print today. The 4th and final volume is entitled The Great Democracies, and the Civil War takes up much of the space that Churchill devotes to American history. By the summer of 1939, Churchill had finished a detailed narrative of the war. He wrote to a distinguished British historian, Sir James Edmonds, saying the following: the Confederates never had any chance at all. It was only a question of the North getting underway and the amount of time to destroy, if necessary, every living soul in the Confederate States. However, Churchill added, quote, but how dramatic is the wonderful resistance they made. Interest in Churchill's account of the Civil War was so high that just 3 years later, in 1961, it came out as a separate volume, still available today, entitled The American Civil War. Not surprisingly, Churchill's view of the war reflected the historiography of the time, in which the South's lost cause stood as a noble, if failed, effort. Churchill sees the origins of the war both in the struggle over slavery, but also other economic and political differences between North and South. Churchill's sympathy for Virginia and admiration for its greatest son, Robert E. Lee, both as a man and a military leader, is clear. He describes Lee this way, quote, one of the noblest Americans who has ever lived, and one of the greatest captains known to the annals of war. Churchill had similar admiration for Stonewall Jackson and considers Jackson's partnership with Lee to be, quote, the high point of the conflict. He calls that war, quote, a struggle unsurpassed in history. But Churchill goes on to note that by the end of 1863, the South knew that the war was lost but, quote, "It is one of the most enduring glories of the American nation that made no difference to the Confederate resistance." Churchill did acknowledge the accomplishments of Grant and Sherman, albeit in less poetic terms. He wrote about the war of attrition waged against the Confederate armies and the Union's determination to break the economic infrastructure and morale of the entire South. Leaping a half-century forward, he recognized in those elements tactics employed by the Allies in the even greater struggle of the First World War. And not surprisingly for a man who loved freedom, Churchill's hostility to slavery appears in several places in the book. He describes the abolition of the slave trade in the British Empire in 1807 as one of Britain's greatest achievements, and favorably notes the searing indictment of slavery in Harriet Beecher Stowe's classic Uncle Tom's Cabin. On another occasion, Churchill said, quote, "Of all the wars that men have fought, none was more noble than the Civil War in America. But all the heroism of the South could not redeem their cause from the stain of slavery." But that said, Churchill, reflecting the thinking of the time, criticized Reconstruction as, quote, "a shameful and discreditable episode." Historians today, of course, have a different perspective, much more nuanced about that time. So you may be wondering, what did Churchill say about Lincoln? Lincoln does not dominate Churchill's narrative, but he recognized the president's stature while recording some of his flaws as a commander-in-chief. Churchill speaks of, quote, Lincoln's natural resolution and generosity of spirit. And Churchill goes on to note, quote, Lincoln's homely humor stood him in good stead. A sense of irony helped to lighten his burdens. His spirit was sustained by a deepening faith in Providence. When the toll of war rose steeply, he appealed for strength to a power higher than man's. And Churchill added of Lincoln, at the summit of authority, it is sometimes necessary to bear the intrigues of disloyal colleagues, to remain calm when others panic, and to withstand misguided popular outcries. All this Lincoln did. To me, that sounds like Winston Churchill speaking about himself during the Second World War. Churchill ends his narrative with Appomattox and Lincoln's assassination. Of Lincoln's death, he wrote, quote, with him vanished the only protector of the prostrate South. None but he could control the bitter political hatreds that were rife. The assassin's bullet, Churchill said, had wrought more evil to the United States than all of the Confederate cannon. If you're interested in reading more about Churchill and Lincoln, there's a wonderful book of that title by our good friend Lou Lerman and a website under the same name. Lou rightly calls them the two greatest statesmen of the English-speaking world, one of the 19th century and one of the 20th. The parallels between the wartime experiences of Lincoln and Churchill and the challenges they faced are striking. How to create and maintain a successful coalition government, how to deal with military commanders not enthusiastic about fighting, how to communicate with a broad public, both in writing and in inspiring speeches, and most importantly, how to defeat dangerous ideologies that crushed liberty and human dignity. Churchill finishes his account of the war with this beautiful epitaph. Thus ended the great American Civil War, the noblest and least avoidable of all the great conflicts of which there was a record. The genius of America was impoverished by the alienation of many elements in the life of the Republic. But after the smoke of the battlefield had cleared, the horrid shape which had cast its shadow over the whole continent had vanished and was gone forever. As the Second World War approached, Churchill reflected on what he learned from Civil War history. Many in Germany and Japan believed America weak and unwilling to step into a new war and fight. Churchill thought otherwise, later reflecting, quote, "Some said Americans were soft. They would never stand bloodletting. But I had studied the Civil War, fought to the last desperate inch." And as the war progressed, Churchill saw in his American allies echoes of the commanders of the last century, saying, quote, "There was about General Lee a quality of selflessness which raised him to the very highest rank of men. And in General Marshall and General Eisenhower, that quality, that character of selflessness has been a bond uniting the Allied armies and a key to our victory." To George Marshall, as well as to Churchill, both Lee and Jackson were heroic figures. And Eisenhower, too, while not a Southerner, had a great interest in Civil War generals and their campaigns. Later, after he retired to his farm in Gettysburg, he too speculated what might have happened if the battle had ended differently. And in 1959, when Churchill made one of his last visits to America, he and the president took a helicopter and flew over the battlefields at high altitude. They then proceeded to tour Ike's farm, driving around in a colorful golf cart. The end of the Civil War also provided Churchill with a classic example of one of his favorite themes, the need for reconciliation in the wake of conflict. After the First World War, he noted that it was rare for a victor to secure by generosity what had been gained by force. In his words, quote, "Those who can win the victory cannot make the peace. Those who make the peace would never have won the victory." Churchill described Grant's conduct at Appomattox as the greatest day of his career and a high point in American history. And he saluted Lincoln's desire for reconciliation with the vanquished. And when the Third Reich capitulated at the end of the Second World War, Churchill said of the German people, quote, "My hate died with their surrender, and I was much moved by their haggard looks and threadbare clothes." And on April 4th, 1865, Lincoln visited Richmond, which had just been evacuated by Confederate forces. He was approached by a delegation of white Virginians anxious to know what fate awaited their state. They must, Lincoln said, quote, "not love Virginia less, but must love the Republic more." And when Churchill wrote his iconic 6-volume history of the Second World War, each volume began with what he called the moral of the work. It is, in war, resolution; in defeat, defiance; in victory, magnanimity; in peace, goodwill. And Churchill was able to put his knowledge of the Second World War, of the Civil War, to good use on other occasions. In March 1943, he visited President Roosevelt in Washington, and the president decided to entertain his guest with a road trip to the presidential retreat, then called Shangri-La. Today, thanks to President Eisenhower, who named it after his grandson, it's Camp David. On the way, when they passed through the town of Frederick, Maryland, Churchill asked, "Isn't this where Barbara Frietchie lived, the woman in the poem by John Greenleaf Whittier, the one who stood up to Stonewall Jackson?" Pleased with his guest's interest, the president said yes and began to recite the poem. "Up from the meadows rich with corn, clear in the cool September morn." But then there was an awkward silence. Apparently, the president had forgotten the rest of the words. Well, Winston Churchill, among his many other attributes, had a near photographic memory. And then, much to his host's delight, he proceeded to recite the 30 couplets of Barbara Frietchie by heart, including its most famous lines, "Shoot if you must this old gray head, but spare your country's flag," she said. I expect the Roosevelts were quite impressed. It turns out that Whittier might have taken some literary license with the story, as there were no contemporary accounts of the incident when it happened, and the best witness, Mrs. Fritchie, died 3 months later at age 95. It's not clear if Stonewall Jackson ever marched down her street or ordered his men to fire on the Union flag. And it also seems that Mrs. Fritchie, while a Union supporter, might herself have owned slaves. But this poem, after being published in the Atlantic magazine the following year, soon became one of the most popular and inspiring works of the Civil War. It was taught to generations of school children for years afterwards, at least in some parts of the country. Its canonical fame must have leapt the Atlantic, and Churchill probably read and memorized it in his early education. John Greenleaf Whittier was a Quaker, and being a pacifist, he found it hard to write poetry during a terrible war that was both patriotic but also nonviolent. No wonder that when he heard the story of Barbara Fritchie, he quickly set it to verse as a perfect example of what we would today call passive resistance. But the following year, 1864, the Union was war-weary, and while it was clear that the South could not win on the battlefield alone, many Northerners were hoping for a negotiated settlement. An election loomed in November, and it was by no means clear that Lincoln and the Republican Party would be returned to office. Thus, for Whittier and his fellow Northerners who were dedicated to the unconditional defeat of the Confederacy, the story of Barbara Ritchie was quite a tonic. Since 1927, a replica of her house has been a local tourist attraction in Frederick, and her name has been plastered on souvenirs such as Maryland hams and canned vegetables. And last but not least, she was parodied in a Rocky and Bullwinkle TV cartoon in the 1960s. How much more famous can you get than that? So let's finish this story about Churchill and the Civil War with this. 8 years after that 1943 Maryland incident, in the summer of 1951, Harry Byrd, who was then a young journalist, visited Winston Churchill in London. The conversation quickly turned to the Civil War, and Byrd reported, quote, "In 50 minutes, Mr. Churchill told me more about the history of the area in which I had lived my entire life than I had ever known. His monologue was spontaneous, said with glee, relish, and enthusiasm. I kept thinking, why do I know so little about these great events?" And then the Civil War was to appear one last time in Churchill's life. On January 30th, 1965, 6 days after his death at age 90, a great state funeral for Winston Churchill was held at St. Paul's Cathedral. 25 years before, an iconic photograph of that great cathedral rising undamaged above the smoke of German bombs had come to symbolize the will and resilience of Winston Churchill and the British people. Churchill loved popular songs, and one of his favorites was the great Union anthem, Julia Ward Howe's Battle Hymn of the Republic. He had heard it on New Year's Day, 1942, when he and Franklin Roosevelt worshiped together at historic Christ Church in Alexandria, sitting in the very pew that had been used by George Washington and later by Robert E. Lee. It was said that Churchill wept when it was sung, especially as the priest explained that this was the first time that his Southern congregation had heard music so firmly associated with Northern victory. Churchill asked that the hymn be played at his funeral, saying it would be a tribute to his American mother, and so it was. If you watch the film of that service that you can find online, you will see many a teary eye, both British and American, when those words and that music play. I think that quintessentially American anthem is a great tribute both to Winston Churchill and to our great American Civil War. Thank you.
Okay, great. Lee, thank you for that. Give you a lot of credit for research. But your first slide says the Churchill Center. We need to update it to the National Church.
It was called the Churchill Center, and then when we came here, this was originally the National Churchill Library and Center.
Yes.
And we realized library, fine, leadership even better. So
Indeed.
hence it is the NCLC, National Churchill Leadership Center.
So, Churchill talks a lot about the individuals of the Civil War, generals. In your research and in his book, do you have any insight into him answering the question, why did the Civil War, the American Civil War, begin?
Yeah. Well, he saw it certainly to a considerable extent because of the issue of slavery, but also economic and political and sectional issues. The question of what caused the American Civil War is a subject of considerable discussion, up and including April 17th of 2024. I forget which one of our politicians got into trouble recently by expressing opinions about what caused the Civil War, what didn't. So Churchill sees a combination of things. His writing about the Civil War was very reflective of the 1930s when he was writing the history of the English-speaking peoples, and that was probably the apogee of the Southern interpretation of the Civil War history. Douglas Southall Freeman's 4 volumes of his biography of Robert E. Lee were iconic and won a Pulitzer Prize. Perspectives on Robert E. Lee have changed considerably, especially in the last few years, and his statues don't seem to be as standing as tall as they used to. What's fascinating about Churchill and obviously about the Civil War is how our understanding of those conflicts changes and will continue to change.
So I'm going to ask just a few more questions, and then we'll have time, about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. Thinking of, clearly there was another Civil War before the American Civil War, that being the English Civil War, fought clearly for different reasons. Did Churchill reflect on the English Civil War that inform his understanding of the American Civil War, or did he see them as two separate incidents?
Well, he certainly wrote in the history of the English-speaking peoples. He certainly wrote about the English Civil War. I'm not sure. I can't remember how many pages are devoted to that. When I did this talk for the first time, I said I'm going to talk about the Civil War, and there was an English person in the audience, and you said, "Oh, you mean the one where we chopped off King Charles's head?" And I said, "No, the American Civil War." And he said, well, "That's great. What does Churchill have to do with that? He wasn't even English." So I don't know that there's a direct line between what he thought about the English Civil War or civil wars in general and the American Civil War. We can do some more research and see if we can tie those things more closely together.
Clearly, Winston Churchill was, of course, not just a journalist and a historian, but somebody who made history, who wrote history, lived history. If I can ask you to reflect on the importance of studying history. I know this is a general question, but let me say, we are here at George Washington University, phenomenal university, but unfortunately in their history department, it's no longer a requirement to take a class in American history. Now, if Winston Churchill, 100 years ago, albeit, is deeply understanding of American history, then what's the point? Why is it important to study history?
And this is a great issue in the American Academy today. It is a sad fact that the study of history in American universities has declined as a major. And if you graduate even from a great school like GWU with a doctorate in history, you're not necessarily going to get a job right away. And in fact, ironically, the study of both British history in America as well as our own American history is no longer as much of a focus as it was. For Churchill, history was not an academic subject like, geometry or science or anything else. It was something that he lived and breathed and informed his life so totally. And that comes in part from who he was and his own sense of personal destiny and the recognition in his own mind at an early age that he was going to do something, great in the world. He said, I think he told his mother early on, I am a shining star and I meant to do something in this world. And his writings are full of interesting aphorisms. Study history, and history by all the secrets of statecraft. He also said, the farther you look back, the farther forward you can see. So to him, history was something that really informed his life. And then he knew he was making history, and he knew, as he later said, that he was going to write that history. So that's a very unusual combination of things. One of the things I say today on this general question of what, if someone asked you, what's the point of studying history? And my feeling, especially in today's tortured world, if you understand something about history, it can inform how you think and how you behave and what you do. But if you can understand how someone else, in particular an adversary, thinks about history, that gives you a lot of insight. If you look at the tragedy of Ukraine right now, part of the reason that has happened is Vladimir Putin has this intensely, deeply held and highly distorted view of Russian history, and that's driving him to do what he's been doing. And so you understand other people's understanding of history, that gives you some ability to anticipate or predict, or at least respond to what they do.
Sure. About history. And I love the fact that Churchill was being introduced into our Civil War. But let's go back to our Revolution and what French had to do with their own independence, and Lafayette, and those things that I just was over to West Point, and the chain that was across the river.
Yeah.
And that, all those things are so interesting, so important in American history.
Sure.
And this goes, the reason I'm here is because of the Civil War and that part. But our history goes back so far.
For sure.
We're beyond.
Sure. Let me comment on that as to the French connection. Madame, je connais très bien l'importance de Lafayette dans la guerre révolutionnaire aux États-Unis. That's my very bad Montreal French from growing up a long time ago.
Do you have a question?
We'll get back to that in a second. Okay.
Thank you.
Why don't you finish up and then do some questions? Thank you.
So in terms of any lessons that Churchill took from the American Civil War, there was a question online submitted about, was there a particular battle that he felt, deep, significantly for? Somebody asked, did he learn any tactics? Probably not, given his time as a war leader. But what were the lessons that he took from studying?
Well, I think those are some of the things that I alluded to when I was speaking. And to me, I did a version of this talk at the American Civil War Museum down in Richmond in October.
The former.
Yes, run by Rob Havers, Alice's dad, formerly the Museum of the Confederacy. Churchill's comment, before the Confederate Museum in Richmond, there still flies a rebel flag. It's not there anymore, needless to say, it's gone by the wayside. And what I said that evening was, folks, I know something about Winston Churchill, but you know a lot more than I do about the Civil War. But to me, the Civil War is the first great modern industrial war. The Crimean War 10 years before to a limited extent. But this really changed the nature of warfare. And Churchill said, I think, that in the early 20th century, that the wars of peoples will be far worse than the wars of kings. And the Civil War was the first war of peoples. And then the First World War was that, ramped up. 700,000 Americans died in the Civil War, but I think our population was 30 or 35 million. The extent as a percentage of the population of the country was just incredible. And it was an industrial conflict. And to some extent, the triumph of the Allies in the Second World War was because of the industrial might of the American, especially northern and Midwestern industrial economy of the 1940s, as the emerging industrial economy of the North and the Civil War produced the same result. So I think Churchill saw those parallels and could see some of the history, and his comment about that Americans, would stand for bloodletting and would fight. If the Japanese or the Germans had understood more about the history of the American Civil War, they would have thought twice about getting into war with the United States.
So my last, comic question is, Churchill, he writes that article that, as you say, double negative article in What If. He also speculated about aliens being on the moon. So, he's incredible.
He
Incredible
hasn't been
creativity,
proved wrong, and they might be up.
Yeah, exactly.
Haven't found them yet.
We're still on the hunt.
Yeah.
But take for one moment, try to take his perspective on the general sweep of history, it being a continuum. And, do you think, this is the leadership center. So if you can, I know you're not political science or anything, but what does it mean for leaders to understand that history doesn't start when they're born, it doesn't stop when they die and when they lose power?
I think it gives you a very broad perspective. And for Churchill, history was a continuum. Churchill was a great example of what's called the Whig school of history. And he looked at the evolution of British democracy from the Magna Carta on, and then of English-speaking democracy through the American Constitution as one continuous progress. A few decades ago, Francis Fukuyama wrote a book, I think in 1989, entitled The End of History. And perhaps for a few years after the fall of communism, we could believe in the end of history. I think the lessons of the last few years is that history is not over. I think Scott Fitzgerald once said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. So understanding some history gives you a sense of who you are, who someone else is.
And their motivations.
Yeah, and motivations, and that's understanding your adversaries and their motivations is critical, and that's a lesson we're learning right now.
Indeed. Okay, so we have some time for some questions. Raise your hand, and okay, so I'm going to start. This gentleman right here, and yeah, you could, yes.
Do you have a mic?
Yeah, Alice has a mic, so if you just wait.
I was reading up on Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples, last volume, the Civil War chapters. And one of the things that's striking is that all the chapters are devoted to what was called the Eastern Theater of the war,
Yeah.
not the Western Theater. And there's a part, I know this is nitpicking a bit, but there's a part where Churchill says that the Western Theater in the American Civil War was like the Eastern Front in the Great War. It was important, but it wasn't vital.
And it was neglected by historians.
Very much.
I think less so today. And that's an interesting comment because,
Time out.
It's just two quick questions. First, did Churchill visit the Western Theater battlefields? And second, how much was he influenced by Freeman's biographies of Lee that do focus purely on the Eastern Theater?
I don't recall in his trips through America that he ever was in those in the battlefields in Tennessee or up the Mississippi. He happened to tour the battlefields of Virginia because he was in Washington and Richmond. It was obviously easier to do. Again, I'm far from being a Civil War expert, and I think my sense is that our appreciation of the importance of the Western Theater has grown in recent years. And interestingly, the same thing as you comment about the Eastern Front in the First World War, very much neglected. The First World War is so significant in the memory of even Britons today, and it's almost all about the Western Front, the trenches, the Somme, and everything else. There's an excellent new book by British historian Nick Lloyd about the Eastern Front, and it was enormous, and it was much more a war of movement than the war was in the Western Front. So those are very apt comments. Those analogies, are interesting.
I mean, I would always go to a Canadian to be my expert on the American Civil War. So this gentleman.
We stayed out of it.
Thank you very much. Wonderful talk. I truly appreciate it. That is great. Thank you. Churchill was definitely an amazing person, amazing leader. Maybe the history part of him was lacking, as we saw there, but he did have a big influence. And my question is, he seemed to be emphasizing or enhancing the lost cause myth. But was that because of where he went and he was with? And and talking about alternative histories, if he had visited not with the Byrds, not with Freeman, but with some of the Northerners, and frankly, the Southerners did focus on history more than the Northerners, but if he had boots on the ground in the northern part, would he have come out with a different position?
My sense is that the history of the English-speaking peoples was published in the mid and late 1950s, but was really written in the 1930s after he had toured the battlefields, after he'd gotten to know Douglas Freeman, and they stayed in touch afterwards. So that was really the conventional, my sense is, and you being involved with the Civil War Roundtable would know more than I. That was very much the dominant school of Civil War history, certainly in the 1930s. If you can correct me if I get this wrong, I think there was a professor at Columbia named Dunning, who wasn't, I don't think was a Southerner, and his whole interpretation of the war, which was very widespread at the time, even from as a Northerner, was to embrace this, the nobility of the Southern cause. And obviously, we now look at Reconstruction and the Civil War very, very differently. And history is fascinating because how we understand and interpret it keeps on changing. And perhaps in 10 or 20 years, that pendulum will swing back and forth again. So my guess is Churchill's writing about the Civil War just reflects his time and his influences and what he wrote about. And there was a romantic streak to Churchill, and the romanticism of Jeb Stuart, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson is something that sort of appealed to him. General Grant wasn't as romantic, a figure as the Southern generals were, and I think Churchill perhaps might have been influenced by just those characters and the I said he was a former cavalry officer himself, so cavalry officers dashing around the countryside is something that he probably found appealing.
Yeah. Alice, we'll do Gail in the front.
Great talk. Thank you very
Thank you.
much. I think they can hear me. I'm interested in what you think and what Churchill would say about the interplay between patriotism and history. And you've just commented about how history is reinterpreted and as generations go by and how important it is to us. How does patriotism and the different way we look at our history weave together? What would Churchill have said about that?
It's always dangerous to speculate about what he would say about something more contemporary. My own sense is that there is a link between an appreciation of history and its good and bad aspects, and your sense of patriotism, your obligation to your country. There's a terrific article in the current issue of The Atlantic by David Fromm about Woodrow Wilson, who is someone who was, an idealized, much admired president for a lot of reasons until fairly recently, and now his name is no longer on the school at Princeton. And what's interesting about David Fromm's a wonderful writer. It's something I would recommend you all read, because he points out that Wilson's accomplishments are really considerable, and Wilson really helped to create the modern, American state. But he also was a racist, and he also, expelled middle-class blacks from the federal civil servants. But David makes some interesting comments in that about how you have to balance your historical judgment, and if you have a dogmatic view of the past that is extreme in one way or extreme in the other, you really lose that sense of history. So that's a very good expression of something I've been sending it around to people. It's really worth reading.
So we're going to end with a question from our youngest attendee here.
I love it.
Did Churchill ever document about the war on the water and the Civil War?
Which war? The war?
The Civil War. War on the water, the blockade.
The naval side. I don't. That's a good question. We have a Navy 3-star here. Mike, you should answer that. Are there any U.S. Navy ships named after Confederate naval officers? I doubt it, but perhaps.
Combat.
Yeah.
Charlottesville.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. There you go. So I don't remember specifically that he wrote too much about that. But as I said, the blockade of Germany was a key British strategy during the First World War, and they did keep the German Navy, pretty much, bottled in harbor for most of the war, other than the Battle of Jutland. It was exactly a Union tactic, with some reason, not quite as much success, but considerable success during the Civil War. It's another example of how, history may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So that's a very interesting question. Thank you.
Everyone, thank you for being here, and thanks everyone online. And Lucas, thanks for the great question to end. And please enjoy. We have the room for about another 20 minutes, and you can ask Lee Pollock as many questions as you want. So thank you.